The cedar box is still on my nightstand. I built it 2 years ago from a piece of Tennessee cedar I had sitting in the back of my shop, the kind with the dark grain running through the center like a river on a map. I made it for Reese as a birthday gift because she mentioned once, completely offhand, that she never had anywhere to keep the small things that mattered to her. Stamps she'd collected as a kid. A note her grandmother wrote in her best cursive. Little things. I sanded the edges until they were smooth as soap. I fitted the lid with a tiny brass hinge no bigger than my thumbnail. She cried when I gave it to her. I told her it was just wood. She said some things are just right, and she carried it home like it was made of glass. I never knew what she put inside it. I still don't, not completely. But I know it sat on her nightstand because I saw it in the background of the photos she posted whenever she was up late grading her students' art projects. Those small stacks of crayon drawings and watercolor attempts spread across her quilt while she ate cereal from a mug. I looked at that box in the background of every photo and told myself it didn't mean anything. I was wrong about a lot of things that year. But nothing I was wrong about mattered as much as what Reese said to me at her sister's wedding on the third Saturday of September, when the light was golden and the string quartet was playing something slow and the tears were still drying on her cheeks. She looked at me and said, "I wish it were us. I need to back up. My name is Cal Mercer. I'm 33 years old and I live in Millhaven, Tennessee, a small town on a bend in the Cumberland River where the summers run long and the nights smell like honeysuckle and cut grass. I run a one-man woodworking shop out of a converted carriage house behind my rental on Elm Street. I make custom furniture, mostly bookcases, headboards, the occasional kitchen table for someone who wants something that'll outlast them. It's not a business that makes you rich, but it makes you honest. You put your hands on something and you can see exactly what you've done at the end of the day. 3 years ago, I had a girlfriend named Nora. She was a pediatric resident who matched at a hospital in Portland, and I had no business asking her not to go. We'd been together 2 years. We cared about each other, but caring about someone isn't always the same as being the right fit, and I think we both knew it. The conversation when she left was quiet and kind and completely devastating. We hugged at the airport. I drove home alone and sat on the porch in the dark for a long time. After that, I didn't push too hard toward anything new. I worked. I ran in the mornings before the heat set in. I called my mother on Sundays. The quiet became normal. Reese Calloway came into my life at a neighborhood cookout 4 years ago, introduced by a mutual friend with the words, "Cal, you have to meet Reese." She's the only other person I know who would rather stay home and do a project than go to a bar. We talked for 3 hours standing beside a folding table with paper plates in our hands. She taught art at Millhaven Middle School. She had dark eyes that paid complete attention to whatever you were saying, and a laugh that sounded genuinely surprised every time, like she hadn't expected to find anything funny. We became friends the way you do when you're both a little solitary and suddenly, there's someone who doesn't make the solitude feel like a failure. Saturdays she'd come by my shop and sit on the old stool by the window while I worked. She graded papers and read, and sometimes just watched me sand a piece of oak into something useful. We'd pick up lunch from the diner on Main Street and eat on the tailgate of my truck. Sunday evenings, we had a habit of sitting on her porch with the ceiling fan running and the sky going pink, talking about nothing in particular. Her neighbor had a dog who would wander over and put his chin on Reese's knee, and she would scratch his ears without looking down, still in the middle of whatever she was saying. After a while, people started making assumptions. Mutual friends would ask, in that particular casual tone people use when they're not being casual at all, "Are you and Reese?" And I would shake my head and say, "Just friends," and the person would nod with the slow expression of someone who didn't believe me. Reese handled it the same way. "We're just friends," she'd say, easy and certain, and then she'd move on to something else. I told myself easy and certain meant she'd settled the question in her own mind and I should do the same. There was one thing I couldn't settle, though. Whenever someone asked Reese directly, whenever it became a real conversation rather than a passing question, she'd get quiet for a half second before she answered. Just half a second. long enough that I noticed it and convinced myself I was imagining things. I'd known her 4 years and I still didn't know what that half-second meant. Her sister Becca had been planning her wedding to a man named Tyler for the better part of 2 years. Becca was 28, warm and easy to talk to, the kind of person who remembered everyone's coffee orders. Tyler was a structural engineer who drove a truck older than mine and coached youth soccer on weekends. They were a good match. Everybody said so, and everybody meant it. The wedding was at a venue outside of town, a white farmhouse on a hill surrounded by open fields. Late September, late afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything look like a photograph someone spent a long time setting up. Reese and I drove together because her family's parking situation was complicated and I had the truck. She wore a pale green dress I hadn't seen before and her hair was down. She looked nice in a way I was used to registering quietly and setting aside. "You're staring," she said, not looking up from her phone. "I'm watching the road." "You were staring before you started watching the road. It's a nice dress." She smiled at the phone screen. "Thank you, Cal." We found our seats with her family. Reese's mother, Dot, pulled me into a hug like she always did and told me I needed a haircut. Reese's older brother, Daniel, shook my hand with that firm grip of his and gave me a look that was polite in the way that certain kinds of closed doors are polite. Daniel was 36, worked in commercial real estate, and had made it quietly but clearly known over the years that he considered me a pleasant satellite in his sister's life rather than anything more significant. He never said anything unkind. He was perfectly civil. He just had a way of talking about Reese's future that didn't include my name. We found our row. The ceremony started with the sound of the string quartet and the late afternoon light coming through the farmhouse windows in long, slanted bars. Becca walked down the aisle on their father's arm, and when Tyler saw her, his expression went completely undone. He didn't try to hold it together. He just stood there at the altar looking at his bride like there was no one else in the building. I watched the ceremony and felt the kind of warmth you feel at a well-made thing. Something assembled with care, with intention, where every joint is true. I glanced at Reese somewhere in the middle of the vows. She was watching Becca and Tyler with her hands folded in her lap and her chin slightly down. There were tears on her face. Not one or two, a steady, quiet kind of crying that she wasn't trying to stop. She wasn't wiping her cheeks. She was just letting it happen like it had come from somewhere she couldn't hold back. I looked away. I focused on the ceremony. But something about that image stayed in my chest like a splinter I couldn't locate. At the reception, the long tables were set with white linens and mason jar candles. There was dancing on the back patio, and the air smelled like honeysuckle and something floral I couldn't name. Reese sat with her family through dinner, and I sat at the adjacent table with a few of Tyler's cousins I'd been introduced to, and a man from Tyler's work who told me about his boat for 20 minutes. I watched Reese across the room without meaning to. She laughed at something her mother said. She helped Becca's maid of honor fix a clip in Becca's hair. She danced once with her father, slow and easy, her head on his shoulder and her eyes closed. She was having a good evening. She looked happy. I was glad. And I was also aware, somewhere I didn't examine too closely, that watching her was the thing I'd been doing all night. Later, when the dancing had been going for a while and the crowd had loosened up, I stepped away from the patio to get some air. There was a low stone wall at the edge of the lawn looking out over the field. The string quartet had switched to something slower. The sky was deep blue above the tree line. I heard footsteps and then Reese was beside me, leaning against the wall with her arms folded, looking out at the field. "You okay?" I asked. "I'm fine," she said. Then she was quiet for a long moment. "I cried too much during the ceremony. You weren't the only one. Tyler's dad was really the star of that performance, I'll admit." She half smiled, but it faded quickly. She looked at her hands. "I keep thinking about Becca and Tyler and how easy it looked, how sure they both looked. It was a good ceremony." "It really was." She paused. "Did you notice the way he looked at her when she came down the aisle? Hard to miss." "That's the thing. He wasn't trying to look that way. It just was what it was." She turned and looked at me. Her eyes were still a little red from crying, and the candlelight from the patio caught them in a way that made them look deeper than usual. "Does that scare you, that kind of certainty?" I thought about it. No, it scares me a little, she said. Not because I don't want it, because I'm afraid I'll spend my whole life being careful and reasonable, and by the time I stop being careful, it'll be too late. I didn't say anything. The string quartet played on. She held my eyes. Something in her expression shifted, some careful thing she'd been holding for a long time loosening slightly like a knot given a little slack. "Cal," she said. "Yeah." Her voice went quiet. "I wish it were us." The field was still. The music continued from the patio. Somewhere behind us, someone laughed at something. The whole night went on undisturbed, and I stood there with her words settling over me like the first cold air of autumn, changing the temperature of everything. I didn't speak right away. I wasn't sure I could. She looked at the field. "I know I shouldn't have said that. Reese, you don't have to say anything." She tucked a strand of hair back and straightened up from the wall. "I've been holding that in for a long time and it just came out. Please just," she shook her head. "Please don't make it strange." She walked back toward the patio before I could find my voice. I stood at the wall alone for a while. The last light disappeared behind the tree line. The field went dark and the mason jars on the tables glowed through the farmhouse windows. I wish it were us. 4 years. 4 years of Saturdays in my shop, Sunday evenings on her porch, Sunday evening sunsets, and the dog who wandered over and put his head on her knee. 4 years of just friends, said easy and certain, with that half-second underneath it that I never let myself examine. I wanted to go after her. I also wanted to be absolutely sure before I did. I drove home alone that night. The following week was careful and a little painful in the way that weeks are when something true has been said and neither person knows what to do with it yet. Reese texted me Sunday morning to ask if I wanted to come by for porch time. Normal. Easy. Like the wedding hadn't happened. I said yes. I sat on her porch and drank the coffee she made, and the ceiling fan turned overhead and her neighbor's dog came over and put his head on her knee. We talked about her students. One of her 7th graders had painted a portrait of his grandfather that Reese said made her want to cry in the good way. She didn't mention what she'd said at the wall. I didn't bring it up. But she wasn't quite herself. She was present, she was warm, she was everything she always was, but there was a guardedness she usually didn't carry. A slight care in how she moved through the conversation, like she was reading the terrain for something she couldn't name. I recognized it because I was doing the same thing. The following Wednesday, I had a piece of furniture to deliver to a house on the north side of town, and I stopped by the middle school afterward to drop off a lunch she'd forgotten at my shop the previous Saturday. The art room was between classes. She was tacking a new row of student work to the corkboard, her back to the door, standing on a step stool. "You left your lunch at the shop," I said. She turned, surprised. Her expression opened into something unguarded for a half-second before she pulled it back. "Cal, you didn't have to do that. It was on my way." She climbed down from the stool and took the bag. "Thank you." We stood for a moment in the quiet of the art room, surrounded by her students' drawings and the smell of tempera paint. "Reese," I started. "I'm sorry about what I said at the wedding," she said at the same moment. We both stopped. "You don't have to apologize," I said. "I think I do. It put you in an uncomfortable position." She set the lunch bag down and crossed her arms, not defensively, just like she was holding herself steady. "I meant it, but that doesn't mean I had the right to say it without," she stopped. "We're good, right? You and me. I don't want to ruin what we have." I looked at her for a moment. The windows of the art room let in that flat midday light that makes everything look very plain and clear. "We're good," I said. She nodded. She looked relieved and also, somewhere underneath it, not quite satisfied with that answer. I wasn't satisfied either. I drove back to my shop and spent the afternoon sanding a headboard I didn't need to sand as carefully as I was sanding it, and tried to figure out what I was afraid of. Part of it was Nora. Not that I was still in love with Nora, I wasn't, not in any real way. But the quiet goodbye at the airport had left something behind. A wariness. A reluctance to reach for something important without being certain the reach would hold. But the larger part, I realized, sitting in my shop with sawdust on my hands, was Daniel. I'd spent 4 years knowing Daniel considered me a footnote in his sister's story. Not bad enough to say something about. Not significant enough to take seriously. And somewhere in that 4 years, I'd let his version of me settle into a corner of my own thinking. not a man who plans ahead. A nice enough situation, not a future. I hadn't said that out loud to myself before. It sat uncomfortably once I did. The following Saturday, Reese came to the shop as usual. We were easy with each other in the way we'd always been, mostly, except that things weren't quite as easy as they'd always been, and we both knew it. She was sitting on her stool reading while I worked when I heard voices outside. The front window looks out onto the alley where I sometimes take deliveries. Daniel's car was parked at the curb. He wasn't there to see me. He was on his phone, pacing, one of those calls where you step outside because the conversation needs room. I didn't intend to hear what he said. I was working. My shop isn't loud, but it isn't silent either, and I only caught pieces. His voice carried clearly through the window I'd left cracked that morning. She's been different since the wedding, that's all I'm saying. You know how Reese gets. A pause. No, I'm not worried about her. Cal's a good guy. He is. But Reese deserves somebody who's building something. Not just a nice guy who makes furniture and doesn't think past next Saturday. I set down my sanding block. Reese hadn't looked up from her book. I just think she has a habit of settling for comfortable. She did it with Marcus for 3 years. She needs someone who has a plan. Cal, he doesn't even, I love the guy, but he's been in the same shop, in the same house, doing the same thing since I've known him. That's not ambition. That's just its stasis. I heard him end the call. His car door opened and closed. Reese turned a page. I picked up the sanding block and went back to work. I didn't tell her what I'd heard. It wasn't her fault what her brother thought. And he wasn't entirely wrong. I wasn't a man who'd climbed rungs or built a portfolio or done any of the things that look like direction from the outside. I had a small shop and a modest life, and I'd chosen it intentionally because it let me put my hands on something true at the end of every day. But hearing it said like that, in that dismissive shorthand, knocked something loose. I started showing up a little less, not dramatically. Just I let a Sunday go without suggesting porch time. I responded to texts with less depth. Reese noticed. I could tell by the slight change in how she asked after me, a little more careful, a little less easy. But she didn't push, and I let the distance grow without doing anything about it. A month after the wedding, I was in my shop on a Friday evening late, finishing a cabinet job that needed to ship Monday. The light outside had gone dark and the fluorescence gave the wood an orange cast I didn't like, but I was almost done. My phone buzzed. Reese, are you still at the shop? Yeah, finishing something. Can I come by? I paused. Sure. She arrived 15 minutes later in jeans and an old flannel, her hair loose. She came in through the side door without knocking, the way she always did, and sat on her stool. She looked at the cabinet I was working on without saying anything for a while. Then she said, "You've been pulling back." "I've been busy. Cal," I kept sanding. "I'm not going to pretend I don't notice," she said. "We've been friends for 4 years. I know when you're gone even when you're right here." I set the sandpaper down and looked at her. She was sitting with her hands on her knees and her chin level, the way she sat when she was being very honest with herself. "I heard Daniel," I said. She went still. "A month ago, he was outside on a call. The window was open." Her expression shifted through several things I couldn't fully read. "What did he say?" "Enough." She was quiet for a long moment. The fluorescent light hummed. Somewhere outside, a car went slowly down the alley. "He's not wrong about everything," I said, and my voice came out rougher than I meant it to. "I have been in the same shop, same house for years. I'm not a man with a 5-year plan. I never have been. That's not. I'm not defending myself to you. I'm just saying." I looked at my hands. "You deserve someone who can give you what you want. I don't know if that's me. And I don't know if Reese Calloway spending her life on my porch is the right story for a person like you." It was the most honest thing I'd said aloud in years, and it landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Reese stared at me. "A person like me," she said slowly. "You know what I mean." "No," her voice had gone very quiet and very clear. "Tell me what you mean." I met her eyes. I stopped, started again. "You make things beautiful, Reese. You walk into a room full of 12-year-olds who think they can't draw, and you somehow make them believe they can. You keep every small thing that matters in a cedar box because you don't throw away what's worth keeping." I heard my own voice doing something I couldn't quite control. "Daniel isn't wrong that you deserve someone who's building. I just didn't want to be the reason you settled for less." The shop was very quiet. Reese stood up from the stool. She walked toward me slowly, the way you walk toward something you're not sure is real yet, and stopped 2 feet away. Her eyes were bright. "Cal Mercer," she said, "do you have any idea how long I've been waiting for you to stop deciding for me what I deserve?" I didn't answer. "I don't want someone with a 5-year plan." Her voice was steady, but there was a shake underneath it, the kind that comes from saying something you've held in too long. "I want someone who shows up on Saturday mornings and sits in the same room with me without needing to fill the silence. I want someone who thinks about brass hinges no bigger than his thumbnail because he listened when I said something offhand about a cedar box." She pressed her lips together for a second. "I want someone who makes things that last. Reese, Daniel loves me, but Daniel doesn't know what I've been feeling for 4 years while we all pretended everything was just fine." I took a step toward her. "At the wedding," I said, "when you said it, I meant it. I know you meant it." "Then why did you leave me standing there?" "Because I was scared." It came out plainly with no apology in it, just the truth. I was scared I'd reach for something that mattered and I'd get it wrong. I got it wrong with Nora. I let her go and I told myself it was because it was the right thing, and it was, but I stopped. I spent a long time after that not reaching for things, and you're the first thing in 3 years that made me want to. She searched my face. The cedar and sawdust smell of the shop was all around us. The fluorescent light hummed. "Then reach," she said. I crossed the distance between us and kissed her. It was nothing like a first kiss between strangers. It was like finally arriving somewhere you'd been walking toward for a long time without knowing the name of the destination. She put her hand against my chest, and I felt her exhale like something she'd been carrying had set itself down. We stood there in my shop with sawdust on the floor and a half-finished cabinet behind me and the alley dark outside, and I thought, this is the truest thing I have ever built, and I didn't build it alone. When we stepped apart, her eyes were wet. "For years," she said. "I know. You're slow. I know that too." She laughed, soft and surprised the way her laugh always came, and leaned her forehead against my collarbone. I held her there in the quiet of the shop while the night ran on outside and the ceiling light put its orange cast across the grain of the wood. "What about Daniel?" I asked, against her hair. She pulled back and looked up at me. "I'll talk to Daniel. He's not going to like this." "No," she agreed. "But Daniel doesn't get to decide what I want. I should have told him that a long time ago." I nodded. She was right, and I should have stopped letting him decide for me too. She stayed until nearly midnight while I finished the cabinet. She sat on her stool and we talked the way we always talked, easy and slow, except now there was no distance in it, no careful thing being held back. She helped me wipe down the finished piece with a clean rag and declared it was the best cabinet she'd seen all year, which made me tell her she probably hadn't seen many cabinets this year. And she said that wasn't the point, "Cal, don't ruin it." I drove her home in the truck. At her front door, she turned and looked at me with both hands in her cardigan pockets. "Sunday," she said. "Sunday." She smiled and went inside. I drove home through the empty streets with the windows down and the dark running alongside me, and that feeling you only get a few times in a life, that you are exactly where you're supposed to be and you finally know it. The conversation with Daniel happened the following week. I didn't ask to be included. It wasn't my conversation to have. But Reese told me afterward, sitting on her porch with the ceiling fan turning, that she'd gone to his house on a Tuesday evening and they'd talked for 2 hours. "He said he was just trying to protect you," I said. "He was." She scratched the neighbor's dog behind the ears. "He lost a friend to a bad marriage about 6 years ago. Watched the whole thing from close up. Ever since then he's had this idea that the wrong relationship does more damage than no relationship at all." She glanced at me. "He wasn't trying to be cruel, he was afraid. I know. I told him that his being afraid didn't give him the right to undermine something he didn't understand." She paused. "He didn't take it well at first." "Did it get better?" She considered this. "He said he'd need to see it play out before he changed his opinion, which from Daniel is basically a standing invitation." I looked at her. "Then I'll just have to give him something to watch." She smiled. "I think that might be the most ambitious thing you've ever said." "Don't push it." She laughed, and the dog lifted his head at the sound of it, and the ceiling fan turned, and the evening light went slow and golden across the yard the way it does in September in Millhaven when the summer's almost done. We didn't rush any of it. That was the right way for us. We kept the Sunday porches and the Saturday mornings in my shop, but now she sat closer on the stool and sometimes leaned against my shoulder when she was reading, and I didn't pretend I wasn't aware of her. She came with me to a craft fair in Knoxville where I had a table and helped me arrange the pieces, and told two separate customers with complete confidence that the end tables were worth every dollar, which they were. But it was something hearing her say it like that. Like she knew my work from the inside. I started a new project that fall, a writing desk with inlaid cedar panels that I'd been thinking about for a while. It was the most careful thing I'd built in years. I took my time with the joints. I got the angles right on the first try. I was 2 months in when Daniel stopped by my shop. He knocked on the side door, which he'd never done before. I opened it and we looked at each other. "Got a minute," he said. I stepped back and let him in. He walked around the shop slowly, looking at the finished pieces on the shelves, the tools on the wall, the writing desk in progress on the main table. He picked up a small bookend I'd made from walnut and turned it in his hands. "These are good," he said finally. "Thank you." He set the bookend down. He looked at the desk. "What's this one?" "Writing desk, custom order." He nodded. He stood with his hands in his jacket pockets for a moment, looking at the piece with the expression of a man trying to work something out. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I didn't say anything. I had a phone call outside your shop a couple months ago. He pressed his lips together. "I said some things that were unfair. You said what you thought. I said what I was afraid of. Those are different things." He looked up. "Reese explained it to me. Not what she felt, that's her business, but the shape of things. The fact that she'd been carrying something for a long time and I'd spent 4 years being an obstacle to something real without knowing it." He shook his head. "That's not what I want it to be. I know. I want her to be happy." His voice came out rough on the last word, the way voices do when there's a long history behind the sentence. "She's been careful and steady her whole life, and she's done it for everyone else. She took care of my parents after my dad's surgery. She covered for Becca through Becca's rough years. She never asked for anything in return." I looked at him. "She's good at that. Too good." He met my eyes. "I don't want her spending her life looking after everybody else while the thing she actually wants is standing 10 feet away." I held his gaze. "I'm not going anywhere." He was quiet for a moment. Then he gave a single nod, the same kind of nod he'd given at our first handshake, but with something different in it now. Less of a gate, more of an opening. "Then I guess I'll see you at Sunday dinner," he said. He shook my hand on the way out, firm and brief the way it always was, but his eyes were straight. I stood in the doorway of my shop and watched his car pull away down the alley. It wasn't fixed entirely. You don't rebuild trust in one conversation. But something had shifted in the right direction, and that was enough. Sunday dinner was loud and warm, and Dot hugged me 3 times and told me twice more that I needed a haircut. Becca and Tyler drove down from Nashville where they'd settled, and Tyler asked me about the writing desk, and we talked about joinery for 20 minutes while Reese watched us from across the table with an expression I had just recently learned to read. She was happy. Quietly, genuinely, the kind of happy that doesn't announce itself. After dinner, she and I sat on her porch in the dark while the rest of the house cleared. The ceiling fan turned. The neighbor's dog had wandered over and gone to sleep under her chair. "Daniel was decent," I said. "He was." She leaned her head against my shoulder. "I think it scared him a little, admitting he was wrong. It scares most people. Does it scare you? Depends on what I'm wrong about." She was quiet for a moment. "What are you most scared of being wrong about?" I thought about it honestly. "This, getting it wrong with you." She lifted her head and looked at me in the dim porch light. "You're not getting it wrong, Cal. Not yet." "Not yet," she agreed. "That's why you keep showing up." She smiled, the real one, the unsurprised one. "That's the whole plan." I kissed her, slow and easy, with the fan turning and the summer ending and the dog asleep and all of Millhaven going quiet around us. After a while she pulled back and looked at me with something careful and warm in her expression. "Wait here," she said. She went inside. I heard her footsteps on the stairs. She came back a few minutes later and sat down beside me holding the cedar box, the one I'd made from the dark grain piece of Tennessee cedar 2 years ago. Small brass hinge, smooth edges, the lid that fit just right. She held it out to me. "Open it," she said. I looked at her. She nodded. I lifted the lid. Inside, folded neatly, was a piece of paper I recognized. The tag I'd attached to the box when I gave it to her, just a small card with my handwriting. For the things worth keeping. Beneath it was a photograph. Blurry, taken at an angle like someone had grabbed someone else's phone without thinking, but clear enough that I could see it was the two of us, sitting on a tailgate outside a farmer's market about 2 years ago, both laughing at something I couldn't remember anymore. And beneath that, a single index card in Reese's handwriting. I read it. It said, "The right one was right here. I was just waiting to be sure." I sat with it for a long moment. The night was warm. The ceiling fan turned. "When did you write this?" I asked. "About 6 months after you made the box." She was looking at her hands. "I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it. I just needed somewhere to keep it." I folded the card carefully and put it back inside. I closed the lid. "She cried at her sister's wedding," I said quietly, "and then she looked at me and said she wished it were us." Reese looked at me. "I should have answered you right then," I said. "You answered me eventually. Not soon enough." "Cal," she took my hand. "You're here now." I was exactly there on that porch with her hand in mine and the cedar box in my lap and the whole quiet town of Millhaven running on around us. The dog breathed slowly under her chair. The ceiling fan made its slow circle. Some stories announce themselves from the beginning. They arrive with grand gestures and clear signals, and the sense that every step has been arranged in advance. Ours was nothing like that. Ours was 4 years of Saturdays in a sawdust-smelling shop and Sunday evenings on a porch with a ceiling fan turning. It was a cedar box and a half-second of silence, and one honest sentence said at a wedding when the light was golden and the music was slow. It was two people who were good at being careful, finally choosing to be brave instead. The box sits on the nightstand now, on her side. I know what's inside it. That's enough.